a quiet village, a cold November wind, and gratitude for the dead? Welcome to Marple Manor. I am your host, Hartwell. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Your words bring this mystery to life. Let's begin. November had brought its usual check of grey to the skies and a faint sourness to the hedges where hips and haws now outnumbered leaves. In Much Brining, one of those English places whose church tower seems to have grown from the earth like an honest vegetable, people said the weather had set in, though no one could have told you precisely what it had set into. There was mist among the elms at dawn, and at 11 the bells spoke in a restrained, almost courteous way, as if asking permission to be solemn. Much Brining was proud of something very particular, and prouder still of how shy it pretended to be about it. It was a thankful village. In both the great wars, every man who had gone to fight had come home. The war memorial in the churchyard was a stone without names, merely a blank tablet edged with laurel-carved leaves and the words, "For Deliverance, 1918 and 1945. That day, the vicar had contrived a special service, half remembrance and half thanksgiving, to unveil a newly carved edition, a modest oak board to be hung in the nave, explaining Much Brining's unique good fortune to any curious visitor. Miss Jane Marple, who was visiting her old friend Dolly Bantry at Gossington, did not consider herself a visitor. She had spent too many afternoons in too many such naves, listening to too many sermons on the frailty of human nature, to feel foreign in any English pew. Besides, Dolly had coaxed her along with the promise of a tea organized by the most ambitious committee of women since the storming of the Bastille, which Miss Marple thought a shade unkind but not inaccurate. The congregation arranged itself like a well-rehearsed tableau. The vicar, the Reverend Julian Lamming, was a man of engaging eye-bags and an enthusiastic baritone. His wife, Cora, had made paper poppies with the children in the schoolroom, though everyone knew she had remade each one after they'd gone home. Sir Bertram Vale, who had a chest of medals that were undoubtedly his, and a wife who was undoubtedly new, sat in the front pew. Lady Iris Vale's fox-collared coat seemed to contain no bones at all. She floated rather than sat, and her attention wandered when it ought not. Dr. Miles Redfern, the village doctor, appeared late and squeezed in at the back, smelling faintly of ether and cigar. Edwin Pike, the schoolmaster, thinned his lips nobly and stared at the word deliverance as if it were an irregular verb. Mrs. Emmeline Spriggs, who kept the post office and everyone's secrets in 2 separate drawers, had put on her hat with the feather that always threatened to puncture. The eye of whoever was unfortunate enough to sit behind her. And then there was Miss Leonora Hatch. Miss Hatch had come to the parish by way of London magazine offices, a woman of the sort who said she did features. She was, in appearance, somewhere between well-preserved and very determined to be. Her hair was an uncompromising yellow, her coat an uncompromising black, and her smile a professional instrument. She was writing, she told people, a book about thankful villages, and had been asking questions of the kind that make certain sorts of men extraordinarily forthcoming and certain sorts of women extraordinarily annoyed. She wrote in a small notebook with a violet fountain pen, and had, it was said, a way of producing the notebook again precisely when people had hoped it was gone for good. "She's been ferreting," Dolly Bantry said sotto voce as the organ's prelude fluttered to a stop. "Never trust a woman who smiles while she writes. It shows she doesn't need the truth to be interesting." Said Miss Marple, whose own knitting had more than once been accused of ferreting unreasonably close to human oddity. "It depends what the smile is for." The service itself proceeded with proper seriousness. The new board was unveiled, oak, simple, without vulgarity, and the vicar spoke of gratitude without boasting, of luck without merit, with a delicacy of bearing that made several parishioners later forgive him his habit of misplacing umbrellas. Then came the 2 minutes. The silence in that moment is never the same twice. Sometimes it is sincerely full, sometimes restive, sometimes so thin one feels it will tear if anyone breathes. In much grinning that morning it was dense and kindly, like a woolen blanket. A thrush said one impolite note in the yew, realized its faux pas and subsided. A child coughed and was taken up and out by a mother whose shoes squeaked. And then, though whether it occurred during the first minute or the second no one later agreed, a single bell clanged from the tower. One unplanned, unpracticed note. Not the tower captain's measured ring, but the awkward bang of a hand that had not meant to touch. Heads turned in a ripple. The vicar's, Sir Bertram's, Lady Iris's, even Miss Marple's neat grey head inclined, not to remark upon the intrusion, but because she had seen the quick, reflexive glance that two people exchanged, Dr. Redfern and Edwin Pike, a fraction then away, and because the bell rope was, she happened to know, knotted that week with a particular bow, for she had observed it while coming in. The silence closed again, like water over a stone. Afterwards there was the usual shuffling, and the usual polite exodus to the vicarage hall for tea. The hall had been polished to within an inch of a skating rink. Tables clothed in white were set with layered cakes and loaves of sandwiches like masonry. Miss Cora Lamming had arranged a display of black and white photographs, men in uniform returning home, boys on bicycles, the Cricket 11 of 1937, beneath which was the visitor's book and a fountain pen in a little stand. A hand-lettered card read, "Please sign our record of thanks." Miss Marple sat where she could see the door and the teapot both. Habits formed in village drawing-rooms persist in village halls. One learns that the door shows who is late, and the teapot who is inconsiderate. "I am dying for that lemon cake," Dolly confided. "It's Mrs. Spriggs's. She put something in it." "Lemon," Miss Marple suggested mildly. "Don't be unromantic." Miss Hatch moved with courteous purpose through the crowd, distributing her smile. She drew Sir Bertram aside with a query about the home guard, had a murmured 5 minutes with Mrs. Spriggs that left the feather on the latter's hat trembling, and no doubt registered that Lady Iris did not look at her husband when she laughed. At the visitor's book, Miss Hatch wrote an expansive sentence. There was violet, ink on the pen's nib after, and then turned to "accept a cup of tea from the table," where the schoolmaster was doing his punctilious best. "I don't take sugar," she said aloud, the kind of statement people make in public when they want it generally known that they do not take this or that. Sugar. Nonsense, prisoners. "Of course," said Edwin Pike, regarding the sugar tongs as if they were verbs. He passed her a cup and saucer with the air of one invigilating an examination. Miss Hatch took it, and in that very moment a wasp. November is not kind to wasps, but some live by sheer force of character, bumbled at the rim of Lady Iris's glass. Lady Iris recoiled. There was a ripple. The schoolmaster lifted his hands slightly to assist, and 2 cups on the tray jostled. One slid, arrested by a saucer not its own. Miss Marple's eye, notoriously mild and in truth a trifle short-sighted, registered 2 small matters with the exactness of a receipt. First, that a fine dusting of sugar clung to the lip of the cup, which Miss Hatch now took, though she had declared she did not take sugar. Second, that a faint breath of violet had kissed the rim of the other cup, the one that drifted towards Dr. Redfern, instead, by way of a smudge where a mouth or a nib had rested. "Such a nuisance," said Miss Marple to no one in particular, settling her knitting in her lap. "In these little upsets one is always drinking someone else's tea." "What's that?" said Dolly, but too late. There was a brief interim of talk about the bell, an accident. Everyone agreed, though no one knew whose accident. About the oak board, tasteful was the consensus. About the lemon cake, not enough of it was Dolly's. In that conversational flow, Miss Leonora Hatch lifted her cup, smiled once, an automatic smile, for audience, sipped, frowned, and put the cup down again with a tiny sound that no one noticed, because in that same second the vicar was apologizing For the hall's draught and Mrs. Spriggs's feather had encountered the back of Mr. Pike's head. If Miss Marple watched Miss Hatch's hand drift towards the visitor's book, it was because Miss Marple had always thought that books and hands had conversations quite apart from what was written. The violet pen had left a wetness of ink. Miss Hatch, fussy about smudges, was poised to move the book aside so the next person might sign without ruin. She looked quite well, if a little peevish. It was not until Lady Iris laughed a fraction too loudly at something Sir Bertram had not said, and the schoolmaster at last allowed himself a slice of cake, carefully, precisely as if cutting a conjugation, that Miss Hatch made a soft, affluent sort of sigh and sagged. As flowers do when the water has been forgotten, there is a particular hush that falls when a woman collapses. It is part courtesy, no one wishes to be seen noticing, and part calculation, everyone wishes to be seen helping. Dr. Redfern was at her side very quickly. He had the habit of appearing near misfortune, as if he'd been standing there all along. "Miss Hatch? Miss Hatch?" His fingers sought a pulse and argued with it. "Shock," he said curtly, and then, "Miles, hot water," to no one in particular, which was odd because he was himself Miles. The vicar fetched water nonetheless, as if the Lord had asked. Miss Hatch's eyelids fluttered. Her lips were a surprising, unbecoming mauve, my dear, Cora Lamming exclaimed, and then faltered, because my dear was inappropriate for a woman she did not like. Mrs. Spriggs said, "There now," and placed a hand, capable, ringless on the fallen woman's shoulder. Sir Bertram frowned deeply, grinding resentment at the interruption. Lady Iris looked for once at her husband. It was Miss Marple who said very gently, perhaps she was a little faint. "The air is close," and that was true. The air was full of the odour of polish and boiled kettle, and a certain acid reproof that old buildings give off in damp months. And yet Miss Marple's eyes were quietly on the table, on the 2 cups with their distinctive interchangeable saucers, and on the visitor's book that had been drawn an inch out of alignment with the card beneath it. She was remembering the bell note and the reflex movement of 2 heads, and that very small thing she had noticed about the bell rope's knot as she came into church. Dr. Redfern looked up, brisk. "We must move her into the vestry where it's cooler." His tone had the crispness of someone issuing orders he hoped would be obeyed without question. Pike Sir Bertram her shoulders carefully. As they bore Miss Hatch towards the side door, Miss Marple rose a little as if disturbed by the scrape of chair legs. Her knitting basket slipped. A small cork cap, a tidy little mushroom-shaped thing, rolled from it, wobbling to a stop by the leg of the table. She retrieved it at once, and if anyone noticed that the cork cap fit the nib end of a fountain pen perfectly, no one said so. She glanced at the visitor's book. A half-formed violet curve of an L gleamed on the page, blotting still. Beneath the card, "Please sign our record of thanks," the corner of a smaller card peeped, the sort one tears from a florist's bouquet, with a pricked hole where a wire has been. "Is she—" Cora Lamming began and then stopped, because the question had too large a horizon. Dr. Redfern's expression had set into the severe benevolence doctors use when they must keep both family and truth at bay. "We'll see," he said. In the vestry, there was a scuffling, a murmured exclamation, and then the sort of silence that even the English cannot politely sustain. Dolly Bantry gripped Miss Marple's arm. "Jane," she whispered, "for heaven's sake, what do you think?" Miss Marple's face was, as it often was, full of pleasant blankness. "I think," she said, "that November is a very trying month for some people. It asks one to be solemn and grateful at the same time, and those are difficult postures to maintain without cramp. Don't be arch." "Do you think the bell was an accident?" "I dare say." Miss Marple's mild eyes lingered for a moment on the cups, the book, the little florist's card with its punctured corner, and returned to Dolly's face. "Only, you know, Dolly, in accidents, it is very often enlightening to notice who is quickest to explain them." The vestry door opened. Dr. Redfern stood there, looking suddenly older. He addressed the vicar rather than the room. "I'm afraid Miss Hatch is dead." There was a sigh, collective and startled, as if the hall itself had let go. Sir Bertram swore under his breath. Lady Iris put one hand to her mouth, with the prettiest horror you ever saw. Mrs. Spriggs's feather described a quick arc and settled again, more decisively than was quite respectful. The vicar spoke, gentle phrases about the frailty of life, and someone remembered to close the door on the photographs of men who had gone to war and come back. Tea cooled in cups, and the florist's card beneath the visitor's book curled slightly where the damp of the hall touched it. Miss Marple, seating herself with a little sigh, reached for her knitting. The yarn ran neatly through her fingers, soft as a secret. "One grows thankful," she said quietly, "for very small mercies indeed." Then she added, almost to the needles, "and very wary of the larger ones. They did what people do when death happens in a room not designed for it. They tidied." Cups were drawn together, cake plates gathered into stacks, chairs edged back to the walls. It gave the eye something to rest on besides the shut vestry door. Cora Lamming moved briskly and then would stop, both hands flattening the tablecloth, as if to still the tremor in it and in herself. The vicar murmured to Sir Bertram about telephoning the police. Sir Bertram said he would do it at once because it was a matter for a man with a telephone voice. Lady Iris drifted near Miss Marple and Dolly. And for once her perfume could not impose itself upon the smells of tea and old boards. "It is too dreadful," Lady Iris said, and her prettiness had gained the sincerity that fright lends. "Poor woman. I only met her last week. She asked such very personal questions. I told her our village is boring, but she actually liked that. She seemed to hear herself, and corrected, like to say she liked it." "Yes," Dolly said, "because one must furnish something to such statements. She liked all sorts of things." "She did not like sugar," Miss Marple observed, more to the table than to anyone, and pinched a crumb from the cloth. "One is often emphatic about one's little dislikes in public. I have noticed it makes one feel virtuous at no real cost." "Jane," Dolly whispered, "do you think poison?" "Poison," Miss Marple said gently, "is merely a method. One is more interested in minds than in methods." Her eyes, which had been the color of afternoon sky an hour earlier, had darkened to the exact shade November makes of them. She rose as if remembering that she ought to sign the visitor's book, and moved without fuss to the little stand. The violet ink glistened still in the curve of the half-formed L. Miss Marple had steady hands, more from practice than nature. She wrote very small, "Jane Marple, St. Mary Mead," on the line beneath. The pen behaved perfectly. When she replaced it, she did a thing that is the most unremarkable in the world. She breathed upon the page to see how near to dry the line above might be. The breath sent the small florist's card curling a fraction farther out. She slid it back without seeming to notice. There was a penciled word on it, almost erased. "Thanks" or "Thames." "No thanks," and beneath that a number 14. The hole in the corner had worn a little dark with damp or fingers. It was the kind of thing that would travel and then be kept, because one never knows when a blank card may be useful. Sir Bertram returned. "The inspector will be here directly. Blythe is on his bicycle." He added with a soldier's practicality, "Best not to disturb anything." "Quite," said Miss Marple. Jeanne did not touch the two cups, one with the fine sugar bloom on its lip, the other with the faint violet kiss. It was not the cups she was looking at, but the saucers, because people match what they think they see. The eye is lazy in that way. The saucers had the vicarage hall's set of hairline cracks, like a map of the home counties. Only one had a chip like a dandelion crown. It belonged under the sugar-dusted cup, and did not sit there now. Constable Bligh arrived in a gust of indignation at having had to ride fast up a hill. He was a square young man with ears that remembered caps even when caps were absent. "Right," he said, "because men say right in the presence of things that are absolutely wrong. No one is to leave. I'll keep the vestry closed. Doctor, you'll remain, please." He placed himself by the door as if he could keep death from coming back out again. Dr. Redfern emerged at last, looking as if he had mislaid his breath and was pretending otherwise. "Inspector should be quick," he said. "I'm afraid Miss Hatch is beyond—" He stopped, made a little compressing movement with his lips. "There will need to be inquiries, natural causes," Sir Bertram demanded, uttering the phrase in the full military. Dr. Redfern met that squarely. Not obviously. She had been in robust health so far as I knew. A sudden collapse. Well, he looked at the table and away. We must wait. Waiting is an occupation villages understand. It is done with low voices. It is done while discussing entirely different matters in words that are not about death, but have death under them like a hand under felt. Mrs. Spriggs announced that, shocking as it was, the post must still be sorted by 5, and then stood without moving at all. Edwin Pike cleared his throat twice and did not speak. He had the expression of a man who has witnessed a misfire during an exam and is trying to decide whether to show compassion or keep time. Miss Marple went back to her chair and her needles, and Dolly, who knew that Miss Marple knitted best when she was thinking, did not interrupt. "If one were to faint," Miss Marple murmured to the wool, "one does not usually sign one's name first. It might have been about many things. Inspector." Mackay came in with a lean energy and an apology for the bicycle. He had also taken— there were roadworks and a lorry stuck by the ford. He was not the sort to be flattered by Sir Bertram's handshake or offended by Mrs. Spriggs's feather. He took the room in the iron way a blackboard takes chalk. He had the cups noted, the visitor's book noted, the table noted, saw too the little swirl of scuff by the stand, where a shoe had pivoted harder than necessary. He asked questions in a patient burr that sanded off the brittle edges in people's voices. "Name, please, and when you last saw Miss Hatch looking well." They gave him what they had, like producing spoons to prove one had not stolen the silver. Lady Iris described the wasp with haste and clarity. Sir Bertram provided the hour as if it were a rank. Edwin Pike retailed the tea passing with a fastidiousness that tried not to seem defensive. Dr. Redfern was concise and particular, and if there was a stiffness in his account, it matched his collar. Miss Marple, when it was her turn, said she had observed nothing but a little muddle with cups at the moment of the wasp, and that Miss Hatch had seemed peevish rather than ill when she sipped. She added, in her small, clear voice, that Miss Hatch had told the room she did not take sugar, and that there had been a light dust on the cup she eventually took. "Meaning?" Inspector Mackay asked, not unkindly. "Oh, it is so easy to take what another intended for us," Miss Marple said, smiling as if at a domestic memory, "or to give it to them, of course, when one is being helpful." "Helpfulness," Dolly said suddenly, and then coloured, because it sounded as if she had accused the tea-table itself. The inspector looked at the visitor's book. "This was being signed?" "Yes," Cora Lamming said, anxious to be useful where she had lately felt so useless. "We asked people to note their names. For the parish magazine, you know. Miss Hatch was very keen to write something about being keen to write something." "Did Miss Hatch sign?" Mackay asked. "She was writing something long," Cora said. "Perhaps her address as well. She always wrote more than one hoped." Mackay bent. "Ink's violet," he said without interest, and perhaps with a policeman's superstition that colour never mattered unless it was red. "Miss Leonora Hatch? Yes, that will be the L." He narrowed his eyes, not at the penwork but at the faint smudge by the margin where a thumb with something on it had rested, and transferred a second ghost of violet to the card beneath. "What's this?" "A florist's card," Miss Marple supplied. "They are always turning up. The little holes catch on things." "Been here long?" "Oh," said Cora, "we had a bouquet yesterday for the altar from Mr. Whitlow's shop. I dare say the card is leftover. I must speak to Mrs. Jessup. She puts everything under the book when she dusts because she says it hides the dust until you can do it properly." Inspector Mackay's mouth did something that, on a kinder man, would have been a smile. "We shall try to do this properly." He gestured to the cups. "Doctor, if you please, would you say which Miss Hatch drank from?" "The one nearest the book," Dr. Redfern said, and then, after the beat that gave away he knew more than he liked to, added, "I saw her set it down there. The other had just gone to—" He glanced at Miss Marple, perhaps remembering that faint breath of violet on the rim. "To me, but I put it away when the fuss began." "Sugar?" Mackay asked. "She said she did not take it," Redfern returned, "yet sugar's on this rim, and none on the other." Mackay's hand hovered, did not touch. So there was confusion. "There always is," Mrs. Spriggs put in unexpectedly. "People at tables do not take what is theirs if there's a commotion. They take what is near." "Someone explained the bell," Miss Marple said, as if the thought had just arrived on a saucer of its own. "Who was it?" "The bell." Mackay turned half about. "Oh, there was a single ring, Inspector," the vicar said, distressed at his failure to have explained it earlier. During the silence, very unfortunate. "I am told one of the boys tried the rope." "Which boy?" Mackay said. "No boy," Edwin Pike corrected, his face carefully neutral. "They were behind me, and would not have reached. I imagine the rope slipped in the draught." "There is no draught in the tower," Mrs. Spriggs remarked in the tone of one who knows. "There is dust." Miss Marple's needles clicked very softly. "It is odd," she observed to Dolly, who had long since learnt that oddities deserve sunlight, "that the knot in the rope was a bowline this morning. It is usually a double fisherman's. I suppose someone retied it." "Jane, for heaven's sake," Dolly whispered, half exasperated and half reassured by this domesticity of knots. "It is only that people tie things in the way they are used to," Miss Marple said mildly. "Like making tea, like turning a key." Inspector Mackay told Bligh to keep the door and send to the Whitlow shop to ask about flowers. Yesterday's, this morning's, any that had gone astray. He had the cups covered under a saucepan lid produced by the vicarage kitchen, and Cora blushed as if it were indecent to bring a saucepan into the hall. He took names in order, and Miss Marple saw his pencil pause by two, Edwin Pike and Miles Redfern. It was not accusation. It was merely that he had noticed both had looked towards the bell with the alertness of men who had been taught to listen for the wrong note. "None of you will leave the village," Mackay said finally, and no one laughed because in November, where would one go? He nodded to Miss Marple as he passed, acknowledging without capitulation that she had mind as well as knitting. When at last the chairs had been righted, and the tea poured out or poured away and the vestry door closed upon what had been a woman with a notebook, Dolly sagged in her seat. "I hate the waiting," she muttered. "It is the most truthful part," Miss Marple said. "Between the doing and the confessing there is always a patch of quiet. And what is done, do you suppose?" Miss Marple watched the visitor's book. A single droplet of violet crept slowly along the downstroke of the L, reluctant to dry. "Something quite small," she said thoughtfully. "Something anyone could do if they wished to be helpful." She glanced at the chipped saucer and, for no reason at all that she would have owned to, at the number 14 on the florist's card, and then at the vicar's umbrella in the stand, whose handle had been polished by many worried hands. "Small things," she repeated. "They do mount up, you know." The next morning dawned with a kind of indifferent chill, the sort that only English November can manage. The mist had slipped low over the meadows, silvering the hedges and lying thick in the hollows, as though hiding the previous day's secrets. By 8 o'clock, word of Miss Leonora Hatch's death had travelled the 3.5 miles to every cottage, shop and farm. Death, Miss Marple reflected, was an efficient postman. It needed neither stamps nor proper addresses, and it was never delayed by fog. At Gossington, Miss Marple was taking her tea with Dolly Bantry by the fire when the vicar's boy bicycled up the drive with a message. The vicar requested, no, implored Miss Marple's informal counsel. That was how it was phrased, and Dolly, who had seen the note before Miss Marple could fold it away, exclaimed, "Oh, Jane, they've come to their senses at last. You'll have to go, of course." Miss Marple looked at the fire with an expression that was neither surprise nor satisfaction. "One never goes to be clever, my dear. One goes to be useful." She set down her cup and added softly, "Though in this case I should like to be both." By 9:30 she was at the vicarage. The hall smelled of damp wool and polish, and the vicar's wife greeted her in that flustered way peculiar to women who have tried to tidy tragedy out of sight. "You understand, Miss Marple, the inspector is quite capable, but Mr. Lamming feels, well, that local insight might smooth things. It has all been so shocking. She was alive and then dead," said Miss Marple kindly. "It happens more often than we remember until it does." The vicar appeared, grave and somewhat bewildered by the implications of hospitality during investigation. He led Miss Marple to the small study, where Inspector Mackay was standing before the cold fireplace, hat in hand, but mind very much awake. "Miss Marple," he said in his measured burr, "good of you to come. I believe you noticed a few details yesterday. Cup and sugar, was it?" "Such domestic trifles often turn out not to be trifles at all," she said mildly. "They're so easy to overlook, and that's precisely why someone might rely on them." He nodded slowly. "Dr. Redfern says there was no sign of heart failure. Poisoning suspected. The county chemist's taking samples from both cups. But until we know more, I'd like to understand what kind of woman this Miss Hatch was." "You saw her only briefly?" "Yes, though one can tell a good deal in a short time," Miss Marple said. "She had the air of someone accustomed to watching others while expecting not to be watched herself. I should imagine she took pride in what she knew, and perhaps greater pride in what she intended to find out." The vicar shifted uneasily. "She was a journalist, of course. But she spoke to everyone, Sir Bertram, Mrs. Spriggs, even young Pike. I thought it very enterprising." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "And did she ask about the war memorial?" "She did, yes. Said she found it curious that our village had lost no one. Wanted to verify that all names were accounted for. I told her, well, everyone came home. That's what makes us a thankful village." Inspector Mackay's eyes sharpened slightly. "She was verifying it, you say? Was there reason to doubt it?" The vicar looked startled. "Good heavens, no. It's been our pride since 1918. The records are quite clear." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And yet, people sometimes prefer a comforting story to a complicated one. I dare say Miss Hatch had an instinct for such complications. A thankful village is a tempting legend for a writer who enjoys turning stones." Mackay's pencil scratched quietly across his notebook. "She was turning one too many, perhaps." He looked up. "Tell me, Miss Marple, you mentioned yesterday that the bell rang by accident. You seem doubtful." "Oh, not doubtful," Miss Marple said. "Only observant. Bells are like tempers. They seldom go off by themselves. I noticed two men, Dr. Redfern and Mr. Pike, glanced up when it rang almost before anyone else did. Reflex, you might say. The kind of reflex one develops when one has been listening for something expected." The inspector regarded her with the faintest smile of respect. "Expected? Perhaps. Or dreaded. The human face betrays both the same way." Just then Mrs. Lamming entered, pale and fluttering. "Inspector," the chemist telephoned. "He's certain cyanide. In the sugar bowl." The silence that followed had a thickness to it, as though the walls themselves were listening. The inspector exhaled through his teeth. "So she didn't take sugar, and yet she took from the poisoned bowl." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked faintly. "She had brought them along, for they helped her think. Or someone took for her," she murmured. "When people are trying to be helpful, they do the most fatal things. I've often noticed it." "She said she didn't take sugar," Mackay repeated. "Then someone else must have put it in." "Who was nearest?" "The schoolmaster," said Miss Marple. Mr. Pike was handing round the cups. But remember, the table was jostled. It would have been quite easy for cups or spoons to be exchanged without intention. Or with it. Mackay rubbed his chin. "And Dr. Redfern?" "Ah," said Miss Marple. "Dr. Redfern was the only person in the room who knew enough to recognize cyanide, by smell alone, perhaps. And yet he drank from a cup that could easily have been hers. That's a strange risk, don't you think? The inspector considered that for a moment. Unless he knew it wasn't. Outside, a bell tolled the half-hour, and the vicar started as if the sound accused him. Miss Marple looked toward the window. There's something almost ritual about bells, isn't there? They tell us when to gather and when to part, when to rejoice and when to mourn. But yesterday the wrong bell spoke at the wrong time. And someone reacted to that as though it had meaning. The inspector's gaze followed hers. You think the bell wasn't an accident? I think accidents are rarely as convenient as that one, she said softly. If one wanted to distract attention while handling something delicate, say a cup or a spoon, that would have been a perfect moment. The vicar looked horrified. You mean someone planned even that? Miss Marple's expression was calm, almost sorrowful. Oh, Mr. Lamming, in villages like ours, people plan everything, down to how they are overheard. It is merely that most of them plan kindness instead of murder. Inspector Mackay closed his notebook. I'll speak to Mr. Pike and Dr. Redfern again. And the sugar bowl will go to the lab. You've been very helpful, Miss Marple. She smiled her mild grandmotherly smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. I only try to notice what everyone sees and no one looks at. It's remarkable how loud small things can be, Inspector, if one listens properly. When she stepped back into the misted churchyard, Miss Marple paused by the stone memorial. Its blank face gleamed wetly, the carved laurel leaves dark with rain. She looked at the words for deliverance, 1918 and 1945, then at the church door where the bell rope hung, its bowline knot undone and retied roughly in haste. Someone had been here since the service. She reached out and touched the rope lightly. The fibers were still damp. Deliverance, she murmured to herself. A strange word to carve upon a lie. Then she straightened her shawl, and with a look that was both pitying and curious, she walked slowly toward the lane that led back to Gossington, where Dolly Bantry would be waiting with questions and the kettle just beginning to boil. By the time Miss Marple returned to Gossington Hall, the mist had thickened into a pale soup that made even the hedges seem uncertain of their shapes. Dolly Bantry was pacing in front of the fire, her hair in slight disarray, the newspaper unopened beside the teapot. She turned at once when Miss Marple entered. Well, Jane, for heaven's sake, don't look so serene. What did the inspector say? What have you seen? You always see something even when you pretend not to. Miss Marple smiled faintly and unpinned her hat. The inspector is a very sensible man, which is a blessing. But he is also inclined, as men often are, to believe that wickedness announces itself. It seldom does. It wears politeness like a glove. That's all very philosophical, Dolly said, pouring tea with a vigor that made the cups rattle. But what's to be done about this Miss Hatch business? Cyanide, they say. Horrid thing. I never trust anything that smells of almonds. It always turns out to be deceitful. Was it suicide? No, said Miss Marple quietly. Miss Hatch did not strike me as a woman inclined to self-pity. She had the air of one who takes life as an opponent to be outwitted, not escaped. No, she was murdered, and I think she discovered something which made that inevitable. Dolly sank into the nearest armchair. Discovered what, do you suppose? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. That, she said softly, is the question. But we may begin, as always, with the human heart. The clue, if it exists, will be rooted there. She told Dolly of her conversation with Inspector Mackay and of the chemist's findings. The sugar bowl was poisoned, she concluded, and Miss Hatch was not meant to drink from it, or at least not meant to drink from that cup. Someone ensured that she did. The question is whether the murderer acted with calculation or with panic. Dolly frowned. I don't see the difference. Poison is poison. Oh, my dear, there's all the difference in the world, said Miss Marple. A calculated murderer removes obstacles with precision. A frightened one acts because they believe the walls are closing in. If we can determine which kind Miss Hatch faced, we shall know much. The clock on the mantel struck 11, and at that very moment the doorbell pealed. The maid entered with a letter on a silver tray. "From the vicarage, ma'am," she said. Miss Marple opened it carefully. It was a short note from Inspector Mackay. "Would Miss Marple be so good as to join me at the schoolhouse? A matter requiring her observation." "How very gratifying," Dolly said. "You've been recruited again, Jane. Off you go, though I warn you. If you come back with another mystery instead of a solution, I'll throw the teapot at you." Miss Marple laughed softly. "My dear, that would only add another puzzle to solve." The schoolhouse sat at the far end of Much Brinning, its stone walls clothed in ivy now browned by frost. Inside, the smell of chalk and cold ink mingled with that curious stale scent that clings to buildings where children's voices have recently ceased. Inspector Mackay stood near the teacher's desk, his notebook open. Edwin Pike, the schoolmaster, stood rigid beside the blackboard, his face an unhealthy shade of grey. "Miss Marple," Mackay greeted her, "thank you for coming. I thought your sense for small things might be useful again." He gestured to the desk. "We found something that may interest you." On the polished wood lay a folder of papers bound with twine. The topmost sheet bore the heading, "The Lost Name, an Inquiry into Much Brinning's Thankful Dead." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Ah," she murmured. "Miss Hatch's handwriting?" "Indeed," Mackay said. "We found this among her things at the inn. But these pages," he tapped the folder gently, "were in Mr. Pike's desk this morning. He says she lent them to him for comment." Edwin Pike swallowed. "She was writing an article about the village," he said stiffly. "Wanted local context. I only meant to check her historical details." Mackay's gaze was steady. "She wrote notes suggesting she'd discovered an inconsistency in the war records. Something about a missing enlistment certificate. One George Lamming. A relative of the vicar's, perhaps." "The vicar's younger brother," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "He was reported ill in 1917, sent home from France. But I seem to recall hearing he later went abroad. To Canada, was it? A quiet sort of man." "Yes," Pike said quickly, a little too quickly. "There was nothing suspicious about it." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her tone did not. "Suspicion is rarely about what one does, Mr. Pike. It is about what one hides. Miss Hatch was writing about truth, and truth can be very inconvenient when people have lived comfortably with its absence." Mackay lifted a paper from the folder. "This page here," she wrote, "one name missing from the record. Why was he not counted among the saved? Then there's a blot. Ink spilled, as if she'd been startled while writing." Miss Marple touched the edge of the sheet. "She may have shown this to someone yesterday morning," she said. "Perhaps to confirm her suspicions. Someone who wanted the story buried," Mackay said grimly, "and buried her instead." There was a long silence in which the ticking of the school clock grew unnaturally loud. Then Miss Marple spoke, her voice mild as milk. "Tell me, Mr. Pike, how long had Miss Hatch known you before she entrusted you with her work?" He hesitated. 3 days. We met first at the post office. And in that time," she said, "she must have found something in your manner that made her trust you. You see, journalists are rather good at reading faces, but perhaps she mistook reserve for reliability." His hands twitched slightly on the edge of the desk. "I did nothing wrong," he said, though no one had accused him. Miss Marple inclined her head. "No, of course not. But sometimes in trying to keep peace, people do not notice the harm they enable. It is a very English failing." Inspector Mackay shut the folder. "We'll verify this missing record. If there's been deception in that church register, it may tie back to her death. The question is who had most to lose by her uncovering it, or most to gain by her silence," Miss Marple said softly. She looked at the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like a hand. "If she found the name of someone who should have been remembered but was not, then whoever erased that name has already killed once, in a manner of speaking. This time they simply made it literal." Mackay gave her a searching look. "You think it's the same person, then? The one who falsified the record?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that truth is a weed. It grows back unless one pulls it out by the roots." Outside, a bell began to toll. 1, then 2, then 3 strokes. The sound drifted through the mist like a memory refusing to rest. Miss Marple turned her head slightly, listening until the last note faded. "Ah," she said. "Someone's ringing for noon too early again. And in this village, I should say, nothing rings early without reason." The fog lingered well into the afternoon, clinging to the hedgerows and muffling the world, so that even sound seemed to hesitate before crossing the lane. Miss Marple, walking back from the schoolhouse, took the long route through the churchyard, her footsteps soft upon the damp gravel. The bell rope still hung by the door, and though it had been freshly retied, she noticed the fibres were frayed at the point where fingers most often grasped. Someone had tugged it hard and recently. She paused a moment, her hand hovering near it but not touching. The faint smell of polish mixed with the cold scent of stone. Bells and ropes, she thought, are honest things. They do what hands make them do. It is the hands that lie. Inside, the church was cool and dim, the air still holding traces of incense from the memorial service. The new oak board gleamed faintly in the half-light, its smooth surface reflecting the narrow stained-glass window beside it. Miss Marple looked at the carving, for Deliverance 1918 and 1945, and then at the blankness beneath. How easily names could disappear, she reflected, when no one cared to see them written. She turned toward the vestry where Miss Hatch had fallen, her steps almost soundless on the flagstones. The door was ajar. The scent of disinfectant had replaced the faint sweetness of tea. On the desk lay a small pile of hymn sheets, and beside them a torn scrap of paper. She picked it up delicately. In Miss Hatch's brisk upright hand were the words, "Ask Pike about GL." The initials seemed to pulse faintly in the grey light. She replaced the scrap just as the vestry door creaked open. Inspector Mackay entered, removing his hat. "I might have known you'd come here, Miss Marple," he said, his tone more respectful than surprised. "You've the look of a woman who finds the quiet places most talkative." "They are when one knows how to listen," she replied. "People leave their noise behind when they go. The truth remains like dust on a shelf." He smiled faintly. "Dust or clues? I'm not sure which you prefer. Both, perhaps. They have similar temperaments." She motioned toward the desk. "You've seen her note?" "I have. GL. George Lamming, no doubt. But I can't yet see why a forgotten name on a parish list should lead to murder." "Because, Inspector, forgotten things are rarely forgotten by accident," said Miss Marple. "Someone remembered him very clearly indeed, and feared that Miss Hatch would make the village remember him too." Mackay's brow furrowed. "The vicar said his brother died abroad after the war. That's not much of a scandal. Unless," Miss Marple said gently, "he didn't die at all." Mackay blinked. "Run off, you mean? Or reinvented himself? A new life, a new name. One sees it often enough in quieter tragedies. But the question is why a woman from London, 50 years later, should come here to ask about him." She hesitated, then added, "Unless she was told to." "You think someone sent her?" Mackay asked, leaning forward slightly. "Perhaps not in so many words. But gossip travels even faster than trains, and London magazines do love stories that prove the world smaller than it is. Maybe she stumbled upon something in an archive, a letter, a photograph, something that didn't fit. She was curious enough to come here, and someone here knew that curiosity would be fatal." Before he could answer, footsteps sounded on the flagstones. The vicar appeared in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. "Inspector, Miss Marple, there's something I must tell you." "It's about my brother." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, her tone calm but her eyes alight with quiet interest. "That would be George Lamming, I believe." The vicar nodded. "Yes, you see, it's true he was sent home from France, but he never went to Canada. He stayed here in England. We kept it quiet because, well, there was trouble. A court-martial, though he was acquitted. But people talk. After the war he couldn't bear the shame, so he changed his name and went north. I had word of him a few times. Nothing since 28. "And you never told the parish?" Mackay asked. There seemed no reason to drag it all out again. My father said it was better left unsaid. We'd had enough grief. He ran a hand over his thinning hair. Miss Hatch came to see me 2 days before the service. She'd found a record under his real name and wanted confirmation. I told her she was mistaken, but she didn't believe me. Miss Marple's expression softened. I thought it kindest to let the dead rest. Yes, he said helplessly, but I didn't mean her to die for it. Of course not, she said. Still, others may have thought differently. Someone who benefited from that silence, perhaps, or whose own reputation depended on it. Mackay crossed his arms. Dr. Redfern served in the Army Medical Corps, didn't he? Around the same years. And Pike's father. He was quartermaster in the regiment stationed near here during the war. They'd both have access to those records. The vicar looked startled. You don't think either of them— I think, said Miss Marple, that both men are too controlled to let emotions show easily. But yesterday, when the bell rang unexpectedly, both of them flinched. That tells me they share some old understanding. The inspector nodded slowly. I'll speak to them again. As the vicar left, Miss Marple stepped toward the vestry window. Outside, the fog was thinning, revealing faint outlines of gravestones like ghosts arranging themselves for judgment. She said softly, Do you know, Inspector, bells ring at the strangest times in life? Sometimes to summon the living, sometimes to remind us that we are all in our ways guilty of forgetting. Mackay followed her gaze. And you think the bell yesterday wasn't coincidence? I think, she said, someone pulled it at just the right moment, enough to distract attention from the tea table, to exchange 2 cups without anyone noticing. And whoever did that had done it before, with ropes, with knots, with quiet precision. Someone practiced in exact timing. A schoolmaster, perhaps, or a doctor, the inspector exhaled. Both, as it happened, served together in the Home Guard. The doctor treated a few training accidents. Pike kept the records. Then they share more than history, Miss Marple murmured. They share opportunity. Mackay closed his notebook. We'll find which one of them's lying. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, I think you'll find they both are, Inspector, but not necessarily about the same thing. As she turned to leave, her eyes fell once more upon the new memorial board. The smooth, nameless wood gleamed under the faintest shaft of light. Deliverance, she murmured again. Such a hopeful word, and yet one never knows who among the living it is meant for. She drew her shawl about her shoulders and walked slowly into the cold air, where the last echo of the bell still trembled like a heartbeat refusing to fade. The evening fell early in Much Brinning, as if the day itself wished to withdraw from the unease that had settled over the village. Windows glowed faintly behind drawn curtains, and lamps threw small pools of gold across the wet pavements. Miss Marple, walking back toward Gossington Hall, carried with her a sense that something in the air had shifted, some invisible thread stretched tight and trembling. It was not fear, precisely, but expectation. Villages, she knew, had their own nervous systems. Gossip was their pulse, suspicion their breath. Tonight Much Brinning was holding its breath. When she arrived, Dolly Bantry was pacing by the hearth again, her knitting abandoned in a soft heap. Jane, thank heaven you're back. I was sure you'd been waylaid by that dreadful fog, or worse, that policeman. What have they found now? Miss Marple removed her gloves slowly. Nothing new, precisely. Only that the vicar's brother, George Lamming, may not be quite as dead as everyone prefers to think. It seems Miss Hatch was close to proving it. Dolly stopped pacing. But how on earth does that make her murder anyone's business? If the man wanted to disappear, surely he could have done so without killing journalists 50 years later. Disappearance, said Miss Marple mildly, is a kind of lie, my dear, and lies grow roots. When one begins to dig at them, one never knows what may come up. Perhaps something unpleasant enough to kill for. Dolly frowned. And you think Pike or the doctor or both know something about this brother. Each, I believe, knows a part of the truth. But they are not, I think, in league. There's too much tension between them for that. You may have noticed, Dolly, that men who share guilt tend to avoid looking at one another. Dolly poured tea with a nervous clatter. So what's next? You're not going to start interrogating people, are you? It's not quite ladylike, you know. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. My dear, people tell me things because they think I'm harmless. There is no better disguise for curiosity than knitting wool and good manners. She took her cup and sipped thoughtfully. I believe I shall call upon Dr. Redfern first. Doctors see everything, but they learn to describe nothing. The doctor's surgery stood beside the green, its brass plate gleaming dimly under the lamplight. Miss Marple arrived just as the clock struck 7. Dr. Redfern opened the door himself, looking startled but polite. Miss Marple, you're out rather late. Come in, please. The roads are dreadful in this weather. Thank you, she said, stepping inside. The air was warm and faintly medicinal, with the sharp smell of carbolic soap. I thought I might have a word about poor Miss Hatch. One always feels one's duty extends beyond the grave, don't you agree? He hesitated, then gestured her toward the sitting room. I'm not sure what more there is to say, but if it helps the inspector, I'll answer what I can. She took a seat by the fire and began, as she often did, by talking of something that seemed unrelated. Such a trying time of year. The damp settles into one's bones. You must find it hard dealing with so many ailments at once. It keeps one busy, he said, lighting his pipe. And this business with Miss Hatch has made the village jumpy. I've already had 2 patients in tears, convinced the tea at the memorial was cursed. People are imaginative when frightened, Miss Marple said softly, though sometimes imagination has good reason. Her eyes met his across the hearth. You knew the vicar's brother, didn't you, Doctor? George Lamming. The pipe paused halfway to his lips. Good heavens, what makes you say that? You flinched when the bell rang yesterday, she said, still mild. A man reacts like that only to sounds he's heard before, sounds linked with a memory he'd rather not revisit. You served in the medical corps. Was Mr. Lamming one of your patients? For a long moment he said nothing. Then he exhaled slowly, the smoke rising between them like a veil. Yes, he said at last. George Lamming was under my care near Ypres. There was an incident. A court-martial, as the vicar told you. But it wasn't cowardice, as people said. Lamming refused an order that would have killed his entire company for no gain. He was right, but the army doesn't reward righteousness. I helped falsify his papers so he could slip away after the trial. So you were complicit, Miss Marple said gently. I called it mercy at the time, Redfern said bitterly. He wanted a new life. I gave him one. He became someone else, moved south. I didn't think he'd ever be heard of again. But Miss Hatch found him, or found evidence that he had lived, she said. And perhaps someone feared she would uncover your part in it. Redfern looked up sharply. You think I killed her to keep a secret that's 50 years old? Miss Marple, if you knew what I've seen, you'd know death doesn't frighten me enough to commit it. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. No, I don't think you killed her. But I think you know who might have. Who else knew of the falsified records? He stared into the fire. One other man, Edwin Pike. His father was quartermaster then. He helped forge the discharge papers. He always resented it, said we'd tainted the regiment's honor. If Miss Hatch questioned him about George, he might have panicked. Miss Marple rose slowly. Then it would appear we must have a word with Mr. Pike. As she left the surgery, the fog had thinned to a pale ghost drifting over the green. Somewhere a single bell struck the quarter hour, 3 slow chimes. She paused, listening, then walked toward the schoolhouse where the light still burned behind drawn curtains. A shadow moved past the window, sharp and restless. Yes, she murmured to herself, pulling her shawl close. The schoolmaster keeps late hours tonight. But then guilt is a very diligent tutor. The schoolhouse stood in uneasy silence when Miss Marple approached, her steps measured, her shawl pulled close against the cold. Through the window, she could see Edwin Pike bent over his desk, a lamp casting a harsh circle of yellow light across papers scattered like fallen leaves. The man's thin figure was rigid, his movements abrupt, those of someone fighting an inner quarrel. She waited a moment before knocking. just loud enough to seem casual. Pike started at the sound, then rose hastily and opened the door. His face looked older in the lamplight, drawn and grey about the mouth. "Miss Marple." "At this hour?" "I do beg your pardon," she said pleasantly. "I feared I might disturb you, but I wished to ask a small question before my memory failed me. I find that at my age one must strike, while the recollection is still behaving itself." He stepped aside, reluctant but too polite to refuse. "Of course, Miss Marple. Please come in." The warmth inside was faint, as if the fire had been allowed only a half-hearted life. Books lined the walls, though many were turned spine in to hide titles long irrelevant. On the desk, she saw school records, the attendance ledger, and beneath it something else, a folded paper of older stock, creased at the edges. Pike followed her gaze and, noticing, covered it with a blotter too quickly. "I was reviewing reports," he said stiffly. "The inspector was quite thorough this afternoon." "I imagine so," Miss Marple replied, settling herself on a chair by the hearth. "He's a very methodical man. I admire that in police work. It makes up for a certain lack of imagination, don't you think?" Pike's lips tightened. "I wouldn't presume to say." She smiled gently. "Oh, one needn't presume. It's merely observation. People of method rely on what they can measure. People of imagination see the shape of things that hide between facts. Miss Hatch, I think, was one of the latter. She must have seemed, well, unsettling to a man like you." He turned, startled. "Why do you say that?" "She saw too quickly," Miss Marple said, "and she wrote too plainly. That's very dangerous in a small village. People here value privacy more than truth." Pike's hand, resting on the back of a chair, trembled slightly. "You think I resented her?" "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that she asked you about George Lamming, and that you gave her an answer which she questioned. Perhaps she even showed you something that frightened you because it made the past alive again." He swallowed. "She came here, yes. She said she had proof that George Lamming hadn't died abroad, that he'd taken another name. She thought he might even have lived here in much brining for years under our noses." "Did she name that other name?" "No." He hesitated, the word escaping like a reluctant confession. "Only that she meant to find out at once. She said she would confirm it with the vicar after the service." Miss Marple's voice softened. "And then she died before she could." Pike turned sharply to the fire, his shoulders rigid. "You think I killed her? That's what you're here to say, isn't it?" "Not at all," she said, knitting her fingers together calmly. "I'm here because I think you know who did. You see, the murderer had to understand two things: how to create confusion at just the right moment, and how to handle small quantities of poison without hesitation. That limits the field rather neatly to those accustomed to careful timing and precision." He faced her now, his expression torn between guilt and dread. "You mean Dr. Redfern?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. "The doctor helped George Lamming vanish. You helped him stay gone. Yet neither of you had cause to wish Miss Hatch dead, unless one of you had turned his old compassion into fear." "She said she would publish everything," Pike burst out. "Do you understand? This village, our reputation, it would have been ruined. The vicar's name, my father's memory, it would all have come out." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "And did you fear ruin for them or for yourself?" For a moment he looked ready to speak. Then something in him hardened. "You have no proof," he said. "Only conjecture. You're like her, asking questions, stirring ghosts." Miss Marple rose slowly. "Ghosts, Mr. Pike, are simply truths that refuse to stay buried." She glanced at the desk again, at the blotter covering the folded paper. "And I fancy one of them is lying just beneath your hand." He stared at her, pale and silent. She gave a small, regretful nod. "Good evening, Mr. Pike. Do lock your door. Fog makes one feel dreadfully exposed." When she stepped outside, the night air struck her like a damp cloth. She walked a few paces down the lane, then turned to look back. The schoolhouse window glowed for another minute before the lamp inside went out. All around, the village lay hushed beneath its misty shroud. From the direction of the church came a faint sound, a single bell note, quick and uncertain, as if a hand had touched the rope and withdrawn. Miss Marple paused, her breath misting in the cold. "Ah," she whispered to the darkness, "so the game begins in earnest." The sound faded, swallowed by the fog. She walked on, her steps deliberate, her mind already fitting the pieces together. The poisoned sugar, the bell distraction, the vanished brother, and now the schoolmaster's trembling hand. Somewhere among them was not just guilt but intent, the fine distinction that told a murder from an accident, and truth from mercy. And as the church bell gave one last echo, she knew that by morning, Much Brinning would no longer be thankful at all. The next morning dawned brittle and bright, as if the world had been scrubbed clean overnight. The fog had retreated into the hollows, leaving the air clear but cold. Miss Marple rose early, as she always did, and looked out over Gossington's frost-silvered garden. It was the kind of morning that made every sound sharper. The distant ring of a milk bottle, the caw of a rook, even the faint toll of the church bell, now back to its proper hour. Yet there was a heaviness beneath the stillness, like a held breath that had not yet been released. She breakfasted quietly, knitting resting beside her plate, while Dolly Bantry fluttered between toast and curiosity. "Are you thinking again, Jane? That look you've got, that dreadful look of quiet satisfaction. You've found something, haven't you?" "I've found," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "that fear makes people tidy, and when they start putting things in order, they sometimes put something away that ought to remain in sight." "Meaning?" "Meaning," she said, rising, "that I believe the inspector is about to overlook the most important piece of evidence in the village, and I intend to stop him before he does." By the time she reached the vicarage, Inspector Mackay was already there, standing by the gate with a cigarette and an expression of irritation disguised as patience. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I was just on my way to see Pike again. The man's nerves are fraying, and I mean to press him harder this time. I should like to be present, if you don't mind," she said mildly. "Sometimes people reveal more when they're not quite sure who they're talking to." Mackay gave her a long look, then nodded. "So long as you don't start sermonizing." They found Edwin Pike in the schoolroom, his desk neat as ever, his face pale and sleepless. The air smelled faintly of ink and coal dust. He greeted them with forced politeness. "Inspector, Miss Marple, I'd hoped this business might soon be concluded." "That depends on you," Mackay said. "We've confirmed that Miss Hatch's notes mention George Lamming and an unnamed witness who helped alter military records. You knew both details, Mr. Pike. You had the motive to silence her before she exposed what your father did." Pike straightened. "My father was a good man, no doubt, but good men make mistakes, and their sons sometimes go too far trying to defend them." Miss Marple watched silently, her eyes lowered to her knitting, though her attention never wavered. Pike's hands gripped the edge of the desk until the knuckles whitened. "You think I poisoned her," he said, his voice brittle. "That I had cyanide hidden away after all these years? Ridiculous." "The poison came from a bottle of insect killer found in your storeroom," Mackay said sharply. "The chemist traced it. Conveniently near your kitchen, wouldn't you say?" "I keep it for wasps." Pike's voice cracked. "You saw that one buzzing about at the tea. Anyone might have used it." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Oh, indeed they might. Yet only one person in that room understood how to cause confusion, precisely when it mattered. It takes a teacher's sense of timing to make a distraction feel natural. You knew the bell would draw every eye, didn't you?" Pike looked at her, something flickering behind his exhaustion. "You're imagining things." "I never imagine," Miss Marple said gently. "I observe. And I observed your reaction to the bell yesterday, the same as I observed it during the service. You've been in charge of the children's pageant for years. You're the one who teaches them how to pull the bell rope safely, are you not?" He hesitated just long enough. Mackay took a step forward. "So it was you who rang it?" "Ah, yes, but not for any reason. Habit. That's all. I heard the silent stretch and, well, nerves perhaps. I gave the rope a little pull, meaning nothing by it. Meaning everything by it, Miss Marple said softly. You created the moment of confusion needed to switch 2 cups. You thought the poisoned one was meant for Dr. Redfern, didn't you? After all, he and Miss Hatch were standing side by side. She had been prying into the past, and you must have thought he was ready to stop her. You meant to protect him, perhaps even avenge your father's memory. Pike's lips parted, and for a moment his indignation faltered. Don't you know you're wrong? But accidents, she continued quietly, so often happen when people try to do good. You switched the cups to save him, and in doing so condemned her. You must have realized it only when she fell. He turned away sharply, a low sound escaping him, neither confession nor denial. Mackay's eyes darkened. So the poison wasn't meant for her? Miss Marple's expression was grave. No, someone else prepared it. Someone who feared exposure even more. Mr. Pike's guilt lies in interference, not malice. But the true murderer relied on his conscience. They knew he'd act impulsively if Miss Hatch seemed in danger. The inspector frowned. Then who? Miss Marple rose, her knitting folded neatly in her lap. The one who had most to lose from George Lamming's reappearance, she said, and the only person who could have slipped poison into the sugar bowl unnoticed while tending to the church flowers that morning. Understanding dawned in Mackay's eyes. Mrs. Lamming, the vicar's wife, Miss Marple confirmed softly. She knew about her brother-in-law's disgrace. She feared the shame would ruin her husband, the parish, everything she'd built her life upon. She thought Miss Hatch's death would preserve their peace. Poor woman, she forgot that truth never dies quietly. Pike sank into his chair, his face ashen, and I helped her without even knowing. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his shoulder. You were trying to save someone. That too is human. She turned toward the door, her voice barely above a whisper. But mercy, Mr. Pike, is only safe in the hands of those who understand it. Outside, the morning sun broke through the frost, casting long shadows across the schoolyard. Miss Marple stood for a moment, looking toward the church tower where the bell hung silent once more. It would ring again soon, she knew, first for justice, then for forgiveness, and then perhaps for peace. The walk from the schoolhouse to the vicarage was a quiet one. The morning sun had begun to warm the frost into dew, and the mist was thinning into faint ribbons that clung to the yews by the churchyard wall. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts turning not to guilt or justice just yet, but to motive, the true sort, the private kind that hid behind every well-meant lie. She knew from long observation that when a good woman sins, she does it with purpose, not impulse. That, she suspected, would be the case with Mrs. Cora Lamming. Inside the vicarage all was still. The door stood half open as if it too had lost its nerve. Miss Marple hesitated only a moment before knocking. A voice faint and strained called from within. Come in, Miss Marple. I rather thought you might. Cora Lamming sat by the parlour window, a shawl about her shoulders. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, though the knuckles showed white beneath the skin. The sunlight struck her hair, turning it soft brown to pale threads of silver. She looked older than she had 2 days ago, though her composure was almost serene. I suppose, she began, the inspector has told you everything. My husband has gone to the church. He needed time. Miss Marple took the chair opposite her. He's a good man, your husband. He believes in redemption. That's rather rare, Cora smiled faintly. You think I shall need redeeming? I think, Miss Marple said gently, you've already condemned yourself in your own heart. The rest is merely a matter of timing. Cora looked away, her gaze fixed on the garden beyond the window. You must understand I never meant it, not her. When I put the poison in the sugar, I thought, oh, I don't know what I thought, only that it would stop her. I meant to frighten, not kill. You meant to silence, Miss Marple corrected softly. You knew she would take tea that day and that she always refused sugar. But you also knew she might not. You'd told her yourself that the village had a sweet tooth, hadn't you? It was a small gamble and a desperate one. Tears welled suddenly in Cora's eyes. I thought she would taste it, spit it out, complain of bitterness and leave. I never imagined she'd die before I could even speak. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. You had your chance to remove the poisoned bowl before the service. Why didn't you? Cora clasped her hands tighter. Because George Lamming wasn't supposed to matter anymore. My husband had forgiven him long ago. But if the truth came out, that George had lived on under another name here of all places, it would have ruined Julian. The church, the parish, they'd have turned on him. And she said she would print it, make it a headline. A thankful village built on a lie, she called it. How could I let her do that? The silence between them grew heavy. Miss Marple could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel and the distant caw of a rook outside. So you poisoned the sugar, she said. You thought only the guilty would drink from it, and instead an innocent woman did. That's the cruelty of such acts. They don't always know their target. Cora looked up sharply, her eyes bright with misery. You think I'm cruel? I think, Miss Marple said, you were frightened. And fear is the cruelest companion of all. She rose, walking toward the window. When the bell rang during the service, did you flinch? Cora blinked. The bell? I don't remember. I think you did, because you thought someone might already suspect. You'd been in the church that morning, hadn't you? Arranging the flowers under the very memorial Miss Hatch meant to expose. Yes, Cora's voice cracked. It was peaceful then. I thought if I prayed while I worked, God might understand. God often understands, Miss Marple said softly, but people rarely do. The door opened then, and Inspector Mackay stepped inside. His face was grave but not hard. Mrs. Lamming, he said quietly, I'm sorry, but we must ask you to come with us. It will be discreet. Your husband's been told. She nodded slowly, as though she had expected it all along. Please tell him, she said, that I only wanted to protect him. I shall tell him, Miss Marple said, and he will understand, though it will take time. Cora allowed the inspector to lead her away. When the door closed behind them, Miss Marple remained standing by the window. Across the churchyard, she could see the vicar moving among the gravestones, his head bowed. The oak memorial gleamed behind him, sunlight flickering across its polished surface. There was something terribly final about its blankness, as if even now it refused to bear the truth carved upon it. Later that afternoon, when Miss Marple stopped at the church herself, she found him still there. He turned at her step, his eyes hollow but composed. It's strange, he said. She believed she was saving me, but I would rather have borne scandal than her guilt. She believed the same, Miss Marple said quietly. That guilt was lighter than shame, but it never is, you know. He looked at the memorial and then at the rope dangling in the tower doorway. The bell won't sound right for a while. The clapper struck wrong yesterday, made that dreadful note. Perhaps it knew what was coming, she said. He gave a broken laugh. You have a way of making tragedy sound inevitable. Not inevitable, Miss Marple replied, adjusting her shawl. Only human. And there's very little difference between the two. As she walked back across the churchyard, she paused by the freshly turned patch of earth near the wall, an unmarked space where Miss Hatch would soon rest. A robin darted down and perched on the edge of the soil, bright against the brown. Miss Marple looked at it for a long moment before murmuring, The dead are always thankful in their way. It's only the living who must bear the reckoning. The wind stirred, carrying the faintest echo of the church bell, a single measured note that lingered like the memory of mercy. Miss Marple drew her shawl close and walked on, her step steady, her face calm and her eyes far away, seeing the quiet truth that lay beneath every human kindness gone astray. For 2 days after Mrs. Lamming's quiet confession, the village moved as though in mourning for something larger than a single life. Curtains were drawn earlier, voices softened, and the church bell, usually such a comforting part of village rhythm, remained still. Inspector Mackay had gone back to the county offices, satisfied with the facts but troubled, Miss Marple thought, by the tone of them. Facts, after all, never accounted for the human texture beneath. That task fell, as it often did, to her. She spent the following morning at Gossington Hall, mending a tear in one of Dolly Bantry's cushions. Dolly hovered restless, asking questions she already knew had answers. "So, Jane," she said at last, "it's over, isn't it? The police have what they want," the poor woman has confessed, "and her husband's found some sort of peace in tragedy. That must be the end of it." Miss Marple's needle paused in mid-air. "One always hopes for tidy endings, my dear," she said, "but life is not embroidery. If one pulls the wrong thread, the whole pattern shifts. And I have the feeling, just a feeling, that something in our pattern is still untidy." Dolly looked alarmed. "You don't mean you think Mrs. Lamming wasn't guilty?" "Oh, she was guilty enough," Miss Marple said gently. "Only not perhaps of everything. Guilt has degrees like frost. It falls unevenly." That afternoon she walked again to the church, where the air smelled faintly of old stone and damp hymnals. The vicar was in his study, but she found Dr. Redfern there instead, standing before the memorial with his hands clasped behind his back. His expression was unreadable, though when he turned she saw in his eyes a fatigue that went deeper than sleeplessness. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "they told me you were here. I was just thinking how strange it is that this village, which prided itself on losing no one to war, should lose two to peace." Miss Marple inclined her head. "The world has its own arithmetic. Balance always comes one way or another." He smiled faintly. "You make it sound almost just." "I don't believe in justice," she said, "only in consequence. But tell me, Doctor, do you feel relieved now that the truth is known?" He hesitated. "Relieved, yes, and yet I can't help thinking about her husband. Julian doesn't deserve this. He spent his life preaching forgiveness, and now he must forgive the unforgivable." Miss Marple studied him a moment. "You speak with sympathy for the vicar, but what of yourself? George Lamming's name was bound up with yours once, wasn't it? His life owed much to your silence." A shadow crossed his face. "He was my patient, my friend even, and I failed him in the end." "How so?" Dr. Redfern turned back to the memorial. "He came back once years later, not as George, of course. He called himself something else. He wanted to make amends, to confess, but I persuaded him not to. I thought the past was better buried. He took my advice and left again. I told no one, not even Julian. If Miss Hatch had printed her story, it would have come out. Everything I tried to forget, and yet," Miss Marple said softly, "it was not you who tried to silence her. No." He hesitated. "But I might as well have been. I saw the signs that someone was meddling, the poison in the shed, the bell rope tampered with, and I said nothing. I told myself it couldn't be true, that people like the Lammings didn't do such things. That kind of blindness is its own kind of guilt." Miss Marple laid her hand lightly on his arm. "There are many ways to sin, Doctor. Some by action, some by inaction. I dare say heaven has an accountant for both." He gave a small, weary laugh. "You make a grim comforter, Miss Marple." "I try to make an honest one," she said simply. When she left the church, the sun had lowered behind the hill, painting the sky a dull rose. A figure moved slowly along the path toward her, the vicar, walking with that peculiar steadiness of men who have lost everything but purpose. He stopped when he saw her, his face gentle, though grief had hollowed it. "She confessed it all," he said, his voice low. "Yet I cannot hate her. She was terrified, poor soul, and love twisted itself into something monstrous inside her. I've been thinking how fragile goodness really is." "Goodness," Miss Marple said, "isn't fragile, Mr. Lamming. It's stubborn. It survives what we do to it, even if we can't always see it." He nodded, looking past her toward the churchyard. "I shall take down the inscription on the board. For deliverance it rings false now." She shook her head. "I wouldn't. Deliverance comes in many forms. Some are painful, that's all." They stood in silence a while longer, until the bell gave a soft accidental movement in the wind. Its tone was different now, lighter somehow, though still somber. That evening Miss Marple sat again with Dolly by the fire. The cushion lay mended on the chair between them, Outside, the frost returned, silvering the glass. Dolly poured the tea and looked at her old friend with a mix of affection and exasperation. "You know, Jane, for all your cleverness, you never seem pleased when things are solved." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, but they're never solved, Dolly, not really. They simply settle like snow after a storm. Beneath it, the ground is still the same." Dolly gave a soft sigh. "You're thinking of the Lammings." "And of Miss Hatch," Miss Marple said. "She sought truth and found death. Mrs. Lamming sought peace and found guilt. But both, in their own way, uncovered what this village truly was, a place that preferred gratitude to honesty." Dolly stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Do you ever tire of seeing the worst in people?" "Not the worst," Miss Marple said gently. "Only the truth. The worst is simply the part we'd rather not look at. The fire popped, and somewhere outside the bell tolled once, soft, steady, resigned." Miss Marple looked into the flames, her expression tender but distant. "It's a mercy, really," she murmured, "that the dead can forgive what the living cannot." And in the quiet of that November night, with the sound of the bell fading into the cold air, the thankful village seemed to exhale at last. The peace that settled over Much Branning was not the peace of innocence regained, but of truth endured, a thinner, sharper sort of mercy, and perhaps the only kind that ever truly lasts. The last Sunday of November dawned clear and brittle, a rare day of sun that glittered on the frost and turned the smoke from the chimneys into pale ribbons against the blue. The church bell rang again that morning, properly this time, its tone steady and unbroken. Much Branning gathered, as it always did, in quiet ceremony. Yet beneath the soft murmur of greetings and the rustle of coats, there ran a current of something changed. The village had seen itself, truly, and no one entirely liked what they'd found. Miss Marple sat in her accustomed pew beside Dolly Bantry, her gloved hands folded neatly on her lap. The sermon was brief, as though the vicar's voice could not quite manage both faith and forgiveness in one breath. His words were calm, measured, but when he reached the line, "and deliver us from evil," there was the smallest tremor in his tone. Miss Marple looked up at him with compassion, but said nothing. Some revelations, she knew, were sermons in themselves. After the service, the congregation lingered in the churchyard, the cold air full of polite half-whispers and uncomfortable glances. Miss Marple made her way slowly toward the memorial, pausing when she reached the stone that had been the beginning of it all. A small brass plate had been newly affixed beneath the carved inscription. It read simply, "George Lamming, remembered in peace." The vicar approached then, his eyes tired but peaceful. "It was Inspector Mackay's suggestion," he said quietly. "He said the truth ought not to vanish a second time." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A sensible man. The truth does tend to wander off if not properly attended to." He looked down at the name, and a small, genuine smile touched his face. Cora would have liked this. For all her fear of scandal, she hated deceit even more. It simply took her too long to realize she was living one. "She acted out of love," Miss Marple said gently, "and fear, of course, which so often travels in its shadow. The two are dreadfully difficult to tell apart until too late." "Do you believe she'll find forgiveness?" he asked softly. "I do," said Miss Marple. "But forgiveness isn't a place we go to, Reverend. It's a direction we start walking in. I expect she's well on her way." He bowed his head, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then he turned and walked back toward the church, leaving Miss Marple standing alone beside the memorial. The sun had warmed the stone enough to show faint traces of her reflection on its polished surface. A small, white-haired figure, clear yet insubstantial, like memory itself. Dolly Bantry joined her presently, wrapped in fur and brimming with restrained curiosity. "Well, Jane, I must say you've outdone yourself this time. A poisoned sugar bowl, a vanished soldier, a guilty wife. It's all so very tragic, but rather elegant too in its way." Miss Marple gave a little laugh. "Murder is rarely elegant, my dear, only neatly disguised. The sugar bowl was merely a stage prop. What mattered was who could reach it without being seen." Mrs. Lamming had the perfect opportunity while she was arranging the flowers that morning. The church was empty and she was trusted. No one questions a vicar's wife with lilies in her hands. Dolly shivered. It's dreadful, really, the ease of it. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. It always is. Evil seldom looks the part. She wears a sensible hat and speaks kindly at tea. But if one listens closely, very closely, one hears the wrong note, the one sound that doesn't belong. Like that bell the day it rang in the silence. Dolly sighed. I shall never hear a church bell again without wondering who's pulling the rope. Miss Marple smiled, a touch of melancholy in her eyes. That's rather the point of such stories, isn't it? To make us wonder, to remind us that goodness needs watchfulness as much as faith. They began to walk back toward Gossington, their steps crunching softly over the frost. Around them the village was settling again. Shop shutters creaking open, chimney smoke curling steadily upward, the ordinary hum of life returning after too much silence. Yet Miss Marple knew the peace would not be quite the same. The village had learned something about itself, as people always do when the past insists on being seen. When they reached the lane where the hedgerows met the turning for the hall, Dolly stopped and looked back toward the church tower. The bell gave one last faint toll caught by the wind. Do you think, she asked, that Miss Hatch would have forgiven them? Miss Marple's eyes softened. Oh, yes. She sought truth, not vengeance. I think she would be content to know it was finally told. She paused, then added, though she might have preferred a better headline. Dolly gave a small laugh, and the two women walked on, their figures dwindling along the brightening road. Behind them, the village of Much Brining stood quiet beneath its November sky, no longer quite a thankful village, but perhaps a wiser one, and somewhere, in that vast stillness that follows every mystery's end, the faint echo of the bell lingered, neither mournful nor triumphant, only steady, as though it too had learned the simple truth Miss Marple always carried with her, that peace, when it comes, is not the absence of sin but the understanding of it.